Good afternoon, everyone. Today's talk, as Paige just said, is the last in our series in conjunction with our exhibition, Witnessing Humanity, the Art of John Wilson, on view until June the 22nd before it travels down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, who are our curatorial and exhibition partners. Before I begin today's talk, John Wilson, a special way of looking at the world, I just want to thank my fellow three curators on the exhibition, for it's upon their shoulders, as well as many others, that this project rests. And they are Patrick Murphy of the MFA, Jennifer Farrell of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and Leslie King Hammond, the Dean and Professor Emerita at the Maryland Institute College of Art. And to Julie, Erica, and Roy Wilson, thank you so much for the invitation into John's life. And to Martha Richardson, thank you so much for your incredible support and advocacy throughout the project. I'm going to start today with some of John Wilson's own words. I am a Black artist. I am a Black person. To me, my experience as a Black person has given me a special way of looking at the world and a special identity with others who experience some injustices. Wilson was born in 1922 in Roxbury. He was the second of 5 children born to immigrants from British Guiana, today, now Guyana, and both his present parents came from middle-class backgrounds. But in the United States, his father, Reginald, found steady employment elusive due to the impact of the Great Depression and also because of structural racism. The family was in fact largely supported by Wilson's mother's violet salary as a domestic worker and by welfare. Reginald, though, focused very much on the welfare and well-being of his children, and he recognized John's incredible precocity and natural ability at drawing and painting from a very, very young age, skills that were encouraged by his enrollment at evening classes at the Roxbury Boys Club, where he developed his love of drawing and of the human figure. Unfortunately, though, it was in those years that Wilson already began to face racial discrimination. Clearly the very best at drawing and at painting in his high school, he only succeeded in securing a place at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, where he began attending from 1939 through the advocacy of his instructors at the Roxbury Boys Club, both of whom were graduate students at the SMFA. For the 2 scholarships that were to be given to students at his high school to the SMFA were given to white kids. From his very earliest work as a college student, he's capturing scenes of the world around him that reflected the sense of alienation and the sense of isolation that he felt as a Black artist in a segregated world. It was a world in which he saw no examples of art that depicted the people and the realities of the neighborhood that he lived in. Roxbury, at that point, a melting pot of Jewish, Eastern European, German, and Irish settlers, and from the 1920s, increasingly Caribbean and African American. A number of his earliest student works focus on the figure of a lone boy. Here, in Street Scene, the boy appears to be quite literally ignored, invisible to everyone else apart from a friendly dog by his side. And similarly, in adolescence, the isolated Black boy actually becomes the surrogate for the artist, a connection that Wilson made later in life. I don't even know, Wilson said, if I was conscious of that boy in the foreground of adolescence as a self-portrait or not, but I look back on it, and clearly it is. A sense of estrangement and disconnect is palpable, expressing what Wilson described as the bewilderment and search for understanding of a Negro boy growing up in the midst of the inconsistencies, the squalor, and the cramped, poverty-stricken confusion of life in a typical North American Negro ghetto. Over the course of his life, Wilson fought against such systemic racism. He didn't see himself in the illustrations of art history textbooks, nor did he see himself on the walls of institutions such as ours. Omissions that signaled to Wilson that blacks did not belong in such company and were not thereby significant. Another signifier of how the history and role of Black Americans had been distorted and, at worst, completely ignored. In his own words, the implication was that Black people were not capable of being beautiful and true and precious, that Black people and their special experience were irrelevant and unimportant. From an early age, though, Wilson fervently believed in the power of art to quite literally change society, to empower us, to make people see differently, and that the visual arts could force an audience to see and sense the world through the artist's own eyes and mind, that one of the key roles for an artist was to reveal what he or she described as the true state of affairs, reality. Wilson described how as a Black artist he had, and I quote, a special awareness and a unique position to understand the world, to reveal its truth, to call a spade a spade. His early self-portraits, such as this one, are ones that respond directly to what he saw as the invisibility of Black Americans. And when he did see images of the Black community, those images were ones that he called dehumanized, caricatures, even minstrel-like. Recalling the title of Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel, The Invisible Man, Wilson noted, "In my youth, the Black man was an invisible American. I sense now that I was trying to make Black people become really visible in a world that would only see us, when it bothered to look, as undeveloped." Portraits such as these capture not just outward appearance, but an inner energy, and they exude an extraordinary humanity and empathy. They are authentic, they are positive representations, they have a gravitas and a dignity. They are resolute, they demand attention, they exude determination and personal agency. And this becomes the thread over 6 decades of work, all the way through to Eternal Presence, his sculpture of 1987, made 40 years after the self-portraits we've just seen, described by Wilson as an image you cannot ignore, in effect a retort to what he began to work and think through in those very early drawings and paintings, the ultimate distillation of all that Wilson had been working on in his art since his earliest days. And it's why, unusually, when you step into the first gallery of the exhibition, you have that unusual moment of seeing through to the very last gallery, because the pivot around which the whole exhibition spins is the model for Eternal Presence. It is the link that begins with his very early student work and is the thread through much of his career. And so, in works that reveal an extraordinary maturity from his earliest years, Wilson sought to create what he called powerful and provocative works, to communicate what he knew, what he experienced, what he was moved by, and what he knew was absent. And throughout his life, it meant his art was fundamentally tied to and related to life experience, to force people to get involved with, to identify with his subject matter, to re-experience what he called the kinds of realities he felt when creating the work. And the subject of his choosing across his career was the human figure, friends, family, the ordinary person on the street, and himself. As his wife, Julie, still with us at the age of 97, encapsulated at Wilson's passing in 2015, essentially, he felt that his main objective as an artist was to deliver a message to people about Black dignity, about racial justice, about poor people trying to get a better deal in life. Wilson described how early on he felt himself drawn to his, I quote, fellow human beings, how they looked, how they interrelated to each other, to their environment, and especially how Black people related to the world and how the world related to them. Above all, he wanted us, the viewer, to see what he described as the common humanity and beauty in all people, and through the experience of his art, hopefully, to feel, think, and act differently towards each other. Those powerful and provocative images meant to encourage those of us who did not share the lived experience of those represented in those works to gain a sense, to really understand empathetically what the artist and the individuals represented were actually feeling. And it's worth taking just a moment here to pause on one of the most marvelous paintings in the exhibition, My Brother from 1942, a tender and powerful depiction of the artist's younger sibling, Frederick, set in Roxbury, inspiring Wilson to describe the work as, I quote, not only a portrait of my brother, but a portrait of my neighborhood. And you can see the streetlights and the tenement buildings in the background. It's a perfect encapsulation of how his work is not just about representation, but how it captures the humanity, the soul, the spirit, the inner energy of his sitters through Wilson's remarkable empathy. Significantly, this work was acquired by Smith College of Art in 1943, just a year after it was made, and when he was still a college student. And it reflects the remarkable success he had in his student years. For his work at that time was not just acquired by Smith, but it was also acquired by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it was included in multiple exhibitions, including those at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Carnegie Museum of Art, and the Boston Museum of Modern Art, now the ICA. And last week, in Christina's talk with us all, she noted also how influential Wilson's fellow artist, Alan Rowan Cright, was in encouraging Wilson to apply to the Atlanta University Art Annuals, also known as the Exhibition of Paintings, Sculpture, and Prints by Negro Artists of America. Developed by artist and professor Hale Woodworth in 1942, the application-based annuals played a fundamental role in supporting contemporary Black artists. In addition to awarding prize money, the exhibitions provided a forum for artists to display their work and to connect with each other, as well as with critics, collectors, and prominent cultural figures, including such as the poet Langston Hughes. Atlanta University would then acquire the winning entries for their collection, providing a permanent home for the prize winner's work where it could be cared for, studied, and lent to other institutions. And in a 1970 lecture, Wilson spoke of how incredibly important the validation of these prizes were. I was not only grateful for the recognition and encouragement that particular prize gave me, but it was also important because the prize was from a Black university. It seemed to say that my people were interested in my work and were responding to what I was trying to say. The first work that Wilson entered to the Atlanta Annuals, and the first prize that he won as part of the Annuals, was Black Soldier. Here I show both the preparatory drawing, recently rediscovered, and the painting, and you can see how Wilson reverses the composition from the initial drawing, in which the soldier is in the foreground. He's now placed into the background in the painting, and the image of the mother and child is now placed here into the foreground. The family is shown standing before a tenement building that Wilson described as representing Roxbury. The mother wraps her arms protectively around the young child, who turns their head to look at her. By contrast, her own gaze transcends the canvas, a technique that Wilson used frequently to allow his subjects, and by association him, to address the viewer. Behind them, a man in a military uniform stands facing the opposite direction, signaling his imminent departure. Wearing a pith helmet, he holds his weapon aloft, his pose mirroring that of the Statue of Liberty that is evident in the distance, who holds aloft her torch, a symbol of enlightenment and hope, to quote, "You're tired, you're poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The symbol of the statue would only have been magnified at this particular time, a moment when it appeared repeatedly in United States government propaganda. Posters, for example, appealing to the public sense of nationalism and patriotism. It was promoted as an American icon, a beacon of freedom and democracy, a vision of true freedom. Yet the soldier's position between the sculpture and the family is perhaps illustrative of the profound gap between the dreams of liberty and freedom for which the soldier will fight overseas and yet does not actually possess stateside. Wilson was angry and indignant at this injustice, even though he did not himself serve in the military due to health issues. His brothers, Frederick and William, did. And within the army, Black soldiers suffered the indignities of segregation and were not granted equality. And when they returned from combat, from fighting for those rights of freedoms and issues in Europe, Black veterans simply returned to face the same racial discrimination and violence. I resented the idea of Blacks going off to fight for other people's freedoms, Wilson noted, while others were being neglected here at home. For Wilson and others in the Black community, liberty enlightening the world, to give the statue its full name, was as much a symbol of promises unfulfilled as of hope and of encouragement. The racial implications of wartime were also explored by Wilson in two other works from the period, War Machine and Black Despair. War Machine, shown here, shows a brutish band of Nazi soldiers marching forth. I was an idealistic young African-American art student, Wilson said, struggling to find a way to express my fears and anger about the oppression of African-American people in America. For me, the ruthless, efficient, invincible German stormtroopers became a symbol of all-powerful forces of oppression in which individuals were molded into collective killing machines, fueled by ideologies of hate and racial superiority. I identified with the victims of this Nazi army, and this print is my attempt to make a graphic image of the terror engendered by these troops. The terror, though, of the war at home, with the rampant injustices of profound institutional, systemic, and individual racism, are embodied in the haunting painting Black Despair. Depicting his brother Billy while on leave from secondment to an army base in the Jim Crow South, the work captures the physical and the psychological trauma and cost of military service when it intersected with and was compounded by the traumas of racism. Wilson recounts how this painting captures the moment shortly after Billy found out that he would need to return to the army base, one that he dared not leave for fear of discrimination and violence against him. It's not a depiction of Billy finding out he's about to go on secondment to Europe and to the war itself. And thus the painting doesn't depict the trauma of being sent to the actual front, but the literal despair of knowing there was no escape of a posting back in the Jim Crow South. Wilson draws further parallels between the genocide overseas in Nazi Europe and racial violence in the United States with one of the most powerful works in the exhibition, Deliver Us from Evil, a work which connects the moral atrocities of lynching and genocide. It was a work that he did as a student project at the SMFA, the project being to create a work that would respond to the biblical expression, deliver us from evil. And it is an unflinchingly direct and challenging depiction of the atrocities of war. The image is a haunting evocation of brutally explicit, broken bodies of both war and of extrajudicial racial violence, lynching. A quote that Wilson gave to the Boston Globe almost 50 years after he made this print is especially resonant. "I'm a Black artist and I'm a Black person," Wilson told the Globe. "To see my experience as a Black person has given me a special way of looking at the world. I grew up in a world that said I could be killed if I stepped out of line. There is a core of anger and frustration I have to vent." Both this print and a number of works subsequent to it depict what Wilson considered to be one of the greatest moral atrocities of American history, the lynchings of thousands of Black Americans. Extrajudicial, many were murdered not because they committed a crime or social infraction, or even accused as such, but simply because they were Black and present. Lynchings sought to keep the Black community terrorized and in a constant state of fear, a vicious tool of power and control, bold public acts that oftentimes implicated entire communities. In this two-part composition, Wilson presents the oppression of Blacks in the United States as a kind of mirror image of the Nazi oppression of Jews and others in Europe. On the left, a Hitler-like figure stands defiant at the top. A mother and child, Madonna-like in depiction, are in the middle ground, in front of a father-like figure. The broken bodies of the genocide fill the foreground. On the right, the image of white spectators to the two lynchings. A mother's arm outstretched, daughter at her side, shakes us to our core. And standing amidst the horrors, defiant and bold, an encapsulation of the Black dignity that Julie Wilson spoke of as being core to John Wilson's identity. It is clearly Wilson himself, like many Black Americans at that time, angry and exhausted that there was no reciprocal fight for their freedom, rights, or protection being made by the American government on the home front. And perhaps most startling and powerful of all, whose eyes lock ours, is the small child in front of the standing figure. The earliest work in the show is closely related and was made when Wilson was only 18 years old. And it underlines how one of the reasons that we really wanted to undertake this exhibition, for it underscores the prescience and the continued relevance of Wilson's work. It's a scene that unfortunately is happening in all too many places still around the world today. War Scene of 1940 is a visually indelible rumination, a literal explosion of the horrors and the traumas of World War II that had just begun. Its representation of the catastrophe of the battlefield, a house of worship ablaze at top right, is disturbing, intense, visceral. Nothing is left to the imagination, as the horrors of the screaming skull, almost certainly a reference to the painting shown at lower left by David Alfaro Siqueiros, acquired just a few years before Wilson made this drawing by the Museum of Modern Art, and its attendant fighter bombs and planes fill the sky with impending death and destruction. It's illustrative of how many of Wilson's works have continued relevance to the moment we live in today. And yet here in the bottom right corner, we already start to see the monumental type heads that are a continual thread through Wilson's own work. The first work by Wilson acquired by the MFA is this print, Streetcar Scene, acquired in 1946, a gift of the then director of the museum, George Edgell. And it encapsulates many of the key issues and ideas that Wilson tackles in his earliest work. It depicts the terror, the stress of living while Black in America, always at the risk of disrespect, injustice, even death. It depicts what Wilson described as, I quote, the reality of being Black in this impossible world. It's a work that touches upon economic precarity, racial prejudice, alienation, and isolation. And it's also one of a number of works in which Wilson focused on the connections between economic injustice and racial discrimination. It took World War II and President Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in 1941 to desegregate the defense industries in the United States, a measure that only highlighted the historical economic exploitation of Black Americans. Although the war had expanded job opportunities, Black Americans were aware that the factories or the Navy Yards, as here, that employed them were only desegregated due to increased production demands and the labor shortage created by the draft. As Wilson noted, I resented the fact that almost everyone on my block was on welfare until they needed us in the shipyards and the factories. Stoic in appearance, the single black individual on this streetcar is a manifestation of Wilson's observation that when black people found themselves in such overwhelmingly white contexts, they, and I quote, had to be armed with their sense of personal dignity. Wilson later referred to this print as a reflection of his own anxiety about finding work as a black artist. And here, the individual is identified by his badge as a Navy Yard worker. That anxiety about finding work as a black artist led to a crisis of confidence while a student at the SMFA. And at one point, he almost dropped out. And it was only through the advocacy of his teachers, especially Carl Zerber, that he persevered. And in 1946, shortly after he graduated from the SMFA in 1944, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts awarded Wilson a James William Page Traveling Fellowship for a 2-year period of study in Europe. Though Wilson had hoped for an opportunity to travel to Mexico, he was encouraged to travel to Paris. And in 1947, after he completed his bachelor's in education from Tufts, Wilson embarked for France. And while in Paris, he sought the instruction of the artist Fernand Léger, primarily in the hope of learning about mural painting. Many of Wilson's early works had been in print, and just as he felt that printmaking was one of the most democratic and open of art mediums, so he felt that mural painting was also incredibly accessible. Léger, though, insisted that Wilson instead, and I quote, learn how to use the language of vision, to reveal the core elements of the natural world through the elements of color, of line, and form. Wilson consciously adapted Léger's subjects and style, shifting his own work in the direction of abstraction and away from what he described as the photographic quality of his earlier work. It's also worth saying that it was at this point in time in Paris that he was given the opportunity to visit the collections of the African, Asian, and non-Western objects of the Museum of Mankind. He was profoundly moved by its anthropological and ethnographic collections, attracted to the idea that the majority of these works were created, in his words, to play a functional part of their cultures. And these collections only heightened for him the absence of black figures in the works generally accepted as masterpieces of Western art, all serving to strengthen Wilson's focus on socially conscious themes in his own work. Léger encouraged his students to choose subjects from contemporary life, and a work such as this one, Le Métro, reflects Léger's own interests in the culture of modernity, the urban landscapes of Paris, and of the human figure. Here, Wilson depicts the inside of a subway car, the passengers isolated, lost in their own dream-like worlds. A featureless figure in the foreground clutches a pole, which bisects both him and the composition as a whole. At left, a worker in traditional cap and blue overalls holds a ceiling strap with one hand and an upright bundle of pipes bound with rope in another. The composition encapsulates how Wilson described Léger's own ability to create a new, insightful interpretation of the world by using colors, shapes, lines, and volumes. And prints, such as the Boulevard de Strasbourg, are among Wilson's most overt homages to Léger's style of bold black shapes and primary colors. Their subjects, juxtapositions of labor and mechanical forms, also speak to Léger's own interests. A world that Wilson described as one of a future in which socialism has taken over, a wonderful world that has grown out of contemporary technology. Upon his return from Paris in 1950, he was awarded a fellowship to travel to Mexico. And just months after marrying Julie Amkovich, the newlywed couple moved to Mexico City. A sign of the times, though, was that they had to travel in separate cars due to the anti-miscegenation laws in the South, and it was not safe for them to travel together, and they reunited after crossing the border in Mexico. Just before he left for Mexico, he gave a talk at Wellesley College entitled "The Significance of Negro Culture in America," in which he discussed the position of black artists in America, and it is worth quoting extensively. "The overwhelming majority of Negro artists in all fields express in their work a special message for you if you take the trouble to look at their work, because they are first Negro Americans, then artists," Wilson said. "They cannot be cajoled into thinking of themselves, like many of my white American friends, as being artists first with a capital A, then secondly white American citizens, many of them thinking of themselves as being citizens of the world, or better, the art world. Others range out even further, and in their paintings become citizens of the universe, and they tell you they are painting cosmic, absolute, eternal truths. The Negro artist can somehow never completely think of himself as an individual free to roam the world or the universe as he pleases. The fact of living in any early American community as a Negro is brought home to him at a very early age, and he realizes that there are special truths for him outside of himself, which he has to cope with in his own little community to even become an artist. Since his student days, Wilson was drawn to the art of the Mexican social realists, artists such as José Clemente Orozco, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Diego Rivera. And he was excited by how in their work these artists dealt with socialist ideas and what he described as images of people who were left out or unimportant. And he described how, as a black person, I identified with it. I wanted to do my African American version. He went on, the aim of the Mexican muralist movement was to be spokespeople for the common man. They wanted to create works of art expressing the realities of the forgotten ones, revealing their history, their celebrations, their struggles. Mural painting is a public thing because it's available to masses of people. And so through Mexican art, I began to experience a sense of how to depict my reality. And I think it's beautifully encapsulated in this powerful painting. Although Wilson made just one mural in Mexico, The Incident, his time there was enormously impactful. In Mexico City, he took courses on mural making, and he also worked at the Taller de Grafica Popular, the workshop of popular graphic art, known as the TGP, a collective print shop focused on inexpensive, mass-produced prints that was socially engaged and politically progressive. While Wilson found his time abroad a respite from the systemic racism he experienced in the United States, it was also challenging, in his words, to express long distance the experience of an African American in the States. But a print that he made while in Mexico for trial speaks to that challenge of separation, for it really did prove impossible to escape the news of the racially motivated violence in the North. And it's also an image that really underscores once again the incredible prescience and relevance of his work today. The racially motivated violence in the US prompted at that time for Wilson what he called a monumental rage and bitter frustration at how such injustices flew in the face of freedom-loving America. His words. The trial is a searing commentary on the persistent racial inequality and bias embedded within political and legal systems. A black man stands before a trio of menacing white judges who peer down at him from behind an exaggeratedly high and imposing bench, their faces covered by masks, which you can just see. Wilson described the print as a response to the infamous Scottsboro Boys trial of 1931, in which 9 young black men were falsely accused of raping 2 white women and other miscarriages of justice. As Wilson recounted, the justice system was an unjust system, and the person was guilty before the trial began. Initially, he sought to make the trial as a mural, but ultimately had to make it a print. Wilson described how the image was to show the false racist ideology of white supremacy, and noted that the judges wearing masks were intended to suggest that they were indulging not just, I quote, deceptive fantasies, but hiding their own true humanity. In 1952, Wilson painted The Incident, an explicit and horrifying depiction of American racial violence and terror. Arguably, it's the most explicit depiction of racialized violence in American art up to that point. Only Elizabeth Catlett to date had portrayed the effects of white violence on the black family, and did so at mid-century before racial violence becomes more of a ubiquitous theme in black art. Few others, aside from Jacob Lawrence and Meta Fuller, had chosen such a subject. Made at street level on an exterior wall at one of the schools that he was studying at, the twice life-size work was painted for a course that Wilson was taking on mural painting. The fresco was meant to be temporary. It was actually made on the wall that the students would actually use. But its impact was such that the renowned Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, the then head of Mexico's Department of the Protection and Restoration of Murals, advocated for its preservation. Alas, the work did not survive, but a large number of preparatory studies and subsequent works inspired by it do, a testament to the significance it held for Wilson. Wilson's first encounter with the physical and psychological brutality of lynching was as a child. He recounted how, quote, practically every month there'd be some charred, hanging body featured in the progressive black newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier or the Amsterdam News that his father would read. And Wilson described how, quote, emotionally he saw himself as one of those victims. He described making this mural as a means to exorcise the oppression and the trauma that he had carried with him since childhood. I quote, "The minute you stepped out of the black neighborhood, you knew exactly that you were in a foreign country. You simply didn't belong. I very consciously felt as a young kid this business of the terror that was used to keep black people in their place. I wasn't born in the South, but the South was a microcosm. It was an intense reality of what happened. There was actual physical lynching and murder in the South. There was psychological lynching in the North. I heard someone make a speech once in which he said, well, this lynching and the threat of lynching is what keeps Black people in their place. In the exhibition, we have a color study for the mural. Few artists have drawn attention more powerfully to what Wilson called the moral atrocity of lynching. The work itself is unflinching. The victimized Black body and dehumanizing murder at the hands of the hooded Klansman at right, only magnified by the chilling sight of the terrified mother and her child within the claustrophobic interior space of a house. And it is this that truly sets this depiction of an extrajudicial killing apart from those that had been made earlier. The brutal scene of the lynched body against a Black home, a scene that should be one that is filled with love, with nurture, with comfort, safety, and warmth. And yet instead, it is one that is filled with fear and foreboding of the external violence. Historically, images of women and children preclude such sense of fear and foreboding. And yet here you have the child in almost a vice-like grip from their mother. The mother's fearfulness is palpable as she tightly clutches that child. The outward expression of her inner emotions betrays her deep anxiety. Her brow is furrowed, her darting eyes cast over her shoulder to the threat. The father figure, commanding in his exaggerated presence, holds a rifle and stands at the home's threshold, a threshold to a world that bears awful witness to the devastating and insidious legacy of white supremacist hate. There is also a sense, perhaps, of an accusatory gaze. The scholar Lisa Farrington, who is one of the authors in the exhibition's catalogue, notes how such a gaze silently implicates all those who are aware of white on Black violence, but do nothing about it. The exhibition also has this incredibly beautiful drawing made of Julie in 1952. Fascinatingly, though, Wilson uses the study and in the actual mural itself, both swapping Julie's race from white to Black and her gender from female to male, for she becomes the study of the actual father figure in the mural. Wilson also extracts, and you can see the mother and child here, the mother and child in two subsequent prints. Now, without context, the fear and foreboding seem even more disturbing. But as a colleague said to me when walking through the exhibition, one of Wilson's extraordinary skills is his ability to depict in 50 shades of black the incredible sense of volume and solidity, that magical quality of light that he's able to depict within prints such as these. After 6 years in Mexico in 1956, Wilson and his family returned to the United States. And in 1957, after a short stint in Chicago, they moved to New York City, where Wilson begins teaching in the New York public schools. And it's during this period as well that Wilson also works as a commercial illustrator, including for The Reporter, a bi-weekly liberal magazine published in New York between 1949 and 1968, which supported labor and civil rights movements. For the July 23, 1959 issue, entitled "The Negro Worker Asserts His Rights," Wilson's depiction of a steel worker, bold and defiant in pose, along with 6 illustrations that accompany the article, are among his most searing indictments of the discrimination faced by Black workers. It's perhaps worth taking just a step back here to ask why Wilson is not as well known as he should be. One reason is that his output was relatively modest. He made only about 11 sculptures, about 90 paintings, many of those in his early years, about 55 to 60 individual prints, and then a much larger number of drawings. But what you see on the screen is one of the reasons why that output was relatively small, in that it's very easy to forget that many artists cannot dedicate themselves full-time to their studio work, that they do have to work for a living. And for Wilson, it was initially in illustration and ultimately to a life dedicated to teaching. His work was also figurative, not abstract, which was the favored means of working in the day, and of course as a Black artist working at a time when their work was not broadly recognized within the canon. It was in 1964 that he and his family returned to Boston in order that he could begin a teaching position at Boston University. As I mentioned, teaching had played a fundamental role for Wilson across his life. He held a degree in education from Tufts University, and in the 1940s, while he was still a student or had just graduated, he taught classes at the politically and culturally progressive school, the Samuel Adams School for Social Studies in downtown Boston. In 1949, he also became an art director at the Workers' Children's Camp, known as Camp Wauchika in New Jersey. Sponsored by the International Workers' Order, the camp hosted children of all races and from all backgrounds, and it boasted an incredibly robust art program with some of the most important artists of the period, ranging from Rockwell Kent, Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, Jacob Lawrence, and Paul Robeson, all working at the camp. He also taught in the New York public school system, but it was his tenure at Boston University from 1964 until 1986 that proved to be his longest. Painter Robert Freeman, a former student, remembers Wilson, quote, looking and helping us to really see, not just to look at subject matter, but to really see. Wilson's advocacy and steadfast nature were key to his teaching practice, especially when working with Black students. Quote, his work on racial themes was hugely impressive to a young student like me, describes Freeman. The few of us who were African American at the school had this sense that we could stay and we could endure. He taught us that by being a model of it. Over his lifetime, Wilson was less a committed political activist as being interested in a politics of change. In his words, quote, an artist is ipso facto critical of society, constantly dissecting. I want my art to reach people. I want people to get the message that my art has. I want their social attitudes to change as a result of the things I do. And over the course of his life, Wilson fought against systemic racism, not only in his artwork, but through direct action. Wilson's generosity in uplifting others and as a mentor is one of his key legacies. Though his quest for social justice led him to involvement in various leftist organizations, he was always wary and skeptical of political alignment. And instead, much of his activism supported initiatives for Black artists to be heard and to be seen, especially as part of collective cultural actions across the increasingly politically engaged landscape of Boston. He helped, for example, to establish the Boston Negro Artists Association, certified in 1966 by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which, like similar collectives around the country, centered on community empowerment and pride, becoming a resource of connectivity, supporting artists and exhibitions and research. He was also deeply engaged with supporting the activist, artist, and educator Elmer Lewis, known as Roxbury's Matron of the Arts, in her efforts to create a visual arts centre in Roxbury, to be known as the National Centre of Afro-American Artists. Many of his works from the late 1960s and 70s also speak powerfully to the tumultuous period and reflect the strength gained through organizing, protesting, and working collectively. One of the most powerful works that does speak most closely to the political tumult of the civil rights movement is Oracle. In both a print and a series of drawings titled enigmatically, Oracle, a person through whom a god or deity is believed to speak, the work depicts a black man standing on an elevated platform in the center of a crowd, clenched fists raised to the sky. Wilson described the inspiration for the image as the National Memorial African Bookstore, a landmark of the civil rights movement in Harlem, run by the civil rights activist Louis Michaud. For decades, it was the center of Black literary life and the civil rights movement. And Wilson spoke of how the figure of Oracle in his drawing and print embodied the collective spirit of Harlem's Black nationalists, as well as being an amalgamation of leading Black writers such as James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and Richard Wright. But it's also hard to escape the moment that the work was made in, 1965, a year which saw the assassination of Malcolm X, the Voting Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the 100th anniversary of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the arrival of US troops in Vietnam, and the first major civil rights march in Boston from Roxbury to Boston Common, led by Martin Luther King Jr. Political too, but in a far quieter and much more tender way, is the study for Child with Father. The image of a father's embrace, the father all but invisible, arms forming a protective wall around his child, takes on added poignancy against the turbulent backdrop of late 60s America. This tender image is not bleak, nor is it confrontational, but in a sense it's full of hope and of empathy. The small child at center, enfolded and protected in the arms of the invisible father, evokes the potential of the next generation, while also addressing what it means to bring a Black child into a world fraught with bigotry and injustice. It speaks as powerfully to the moment, 1968, as more overt images of protest. The drawing is a study for a related lithograph that was Wilson's contribution to a portfolio called Artists Against Racism and the War, a group organized in Boston in the spring of 1968 to resist the Vietnam War and protest Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. It was dedicated to the memory and ideals of Martin Luther King, printed just weeks after his death. The portfolio accompanied a series of political actions that took place throughout Boston in the middle of May of that year. And while initially, when you first look at this print or the drawing, it doesn't seem as if an image of the babe in a father's arms is a work that speaks necessarily to a portfolio of prints against racism and the war. As you think more, there can be no more powerful image of the nurture and the love and of the importance of family that was so needed at that particular time. One of the great surprises to me when we embarked on the exhibition project was the depth of Wilson's commitment to the illustration of children's books. And I want to take a moment here to read the words of Equa Holmes, the noted children's book illustrator, a native of Roxbury, who had an exhibition here a number of years ago, and who, in her own early years, was influenced by the work of John Wilson. I quote from Equa, "Wilson was intentional in all his work to reflect his community, and the books he chose to illustrate are no different. This moment, when many important children's books are being banned or forbidden from public libraries and schools, understanding and learning from other viewpoints is essential to our mental and spiritual wellness. These stories allow us to imagine a richer, safer, and more loving world, a hopeful world. Our children lead complex lives. They are living and experiencing all that we see and read in the news, and they need to know that they are not alone in whatever struggles they face." Wilson understood this, and such knowledge is why his art to this day has such a brilliant ripple effect, like a stone thrown into a pond, expanding the mindsets of children and their parents alike. So whether it is the story, the biography of Malcolm X, published in 1970, a book that was intended for readers in elementary school, ages 7 to 10, a book that does not shy away in any respect from the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, or whether it is the beautiful story of Becky, in which the drawings of the most beautiful and moving and touching, illustrating the story of Becky, whose birthday it is, on a shopping trip with her mother, visiting a toy store and seeing a little brown doll that is unfortunately too expensive. And as they leave the toy store, the little brown doll comes alive. And as you can see, flies off the counter of the toy store and follows Becky home in the snow, eventually celebrating her birthday. These are also works that continue to have resonance, effect, and impact on artists today. And one of the most important things that we wanted the exhibition to do was to engage with young artists today, to honor Wilson's many, many years of teaching. And so in connecting with students at Boston University, students who are taking the very same drawing class that Wilson himself taught 50 years ago, those students will be having their own exhibition opening just in a few weeks' time at the Commonwealth Gallery on the Boston University campus, with works that reflect the impact of Wilson's work during visits that they made here to the museum last November, where they studied Wilson's work in the Moore Study Room for prints, drawings, and photographs. But we also worked with the students of the MFA class in visual narrative. And this and this are just two examples of the amazing illustrative work that students from that class made as part of a zine, which is actually available in the exhibition. And I think of anything in the show, it really underscores the continued resonance and importance of Wilson's work for future generations of artists. Wilson thrived on learning, and he described reading with his father as one of the most intimate and important activities he shared with him. To quote, "This sense of nurturing was part of me. When I became a father, I felt very strongly about this relationship." He spoke lovingly of the Sunday mornings when his father would read the funnies from the Sunday newspapers to him. And this bond is reflected in a series of works on paper and in sculpture, in which Wilson explored the subject of a father and child reading together, culminating in a large-scale bronze sculpture of the subject that was unveiled in 1990 on the campus of Roxbury Community College. It really does mark not just his own experience as a father with his children, but it was, in Wilson's words, in essence, a homage to my parents who passed on their love of reading to me. And if you think about it, it is such an extraordinarily unusual subject in the history of art as well. When we so often think of depictions of parents and their children, it is the mother and child, not the father and child. The importance of books and reading for Wilson is also evident in how Richard Wright, one of the most important American writers of the 20th century, was an incredible influence upon Wilson. Born in 1908 near Roxie, Mississippi, Wright garnered considerable critical acclaim during his lifetime for his novels, his short stories, and many critical essays. 2 books, Native Son and an autobiographical novel, Black Boy, earned him the distinction of becoming the first African-American author on the bestseller lists. His writings were immensely influential on Wilson, who titled works after both books. In the Richard Wright suite, Wilson depicts a scene in Wright's novella, Down by the Riverside, one of 5 short stories from the author's first book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Although Wright described the book as one, I quote, which even bankers' daughters could read and weep over and feel good about, the stories implicitly protest the psychological and physical terrors of anti-Black racism. The Prince, by Wilson, tell the story of the man's family's tragic quest for safety after torrential rains caused the Mississippi River to flood a farm under their tenancy. The Prince dramatized the tragic death at the hands of a mob of brother man who has used a stolen boat to take his pregnant wife to a hospital for the child's delivery. Tragically, his wife also dies. I chose to illustrate this story because of Wright's vivid setting. Growing up in Boston during the late 1920s and 30s, I saw gruesome pictures of Southern lynchings in the Black press. I understood that simply being Black was the most important reality affecting my entire life. In the late 1960s, Wilson began to focus, as he had done as a student, on portraiture, creating works, especially drawings, that captured the underlying spirit and essential humanity of those around him. According to the artist, the drawings were not, quote, intended to be lifelike portraits as much as interpretations, symbolic interpretations. Wilson's keen powers of observation are evident in the portraits of his loved ones. It was never neutral, he would later say of his portraits. His renewed focus on portraiture, here executed in brilliant skills in chalks and pastels and charcoals and inks, are a powerful counterpoint to the historical absence or degradation of the Black figurative image in both everyday life and the visual arts that Wilson had challenged from his earliest student days. And among Wilson's most ambitious works are the life-size studies that he made between 1972 and 1975. The Young Americans, an unrealized mural, depict a multiracial group of teenagers whom Wilson viewed as representing a new generation, and by association, a future governed by equality and free of racial prejudice. While the images do reflect a sense of optimism, these portraits are tempered by both his plans for the mural falling through and by the contemporaneous external events, such as the racially charged Boston busing crisis. With an increasing belief that two-dimensional illusionistic images were, in his words, inadequate, Wilson, in his final years, started to shift to sculpture. He saw parallels between making sculptures and drawings, once describing the latter as akin to carving forms out of space, but he was attracted to the broader accessibility of public sculpture in particular. Transitioning to working in clay and bronze, though, proved extremely difficult for Wilson, and he spent many years grappling with technical problems before tackling several large-scale, multi-year commissions, including the 7-foot-tall sculpture of Father and Child Reading, which we've just seen, and the work that a few weeks ago Barry Gator so powerfully talked about, Eternal Presence. This is a time when he starts to think about a monumental head, the early 1970s, a sculpture that could truly meet the challenge of an image you could not ignore, that could not be invisible, that would, in fact, force a confrontation. It was commissioned by Barry Gator for the grounds of the National Center of Afro-American Artists, and you can see here how it quite literally rises from the earth. And here is the half-scale model in the exhibition. As mentioned, he begins to think about it in the early 1970s through a number of drawings of this particular model, Roz, a friend of one of his daughter's friends, Becky. And Roz was described by Wilson as like a living sculpture. And here is Roz herself, adjacent to another drawing that is in the MFA's collection. And here is a very early sketch for the actual sculpture, which was in his head. As Barry said a few weeks ago, the sculpture has become a true landmark of the community, and on an annual basis, there is a celebration called Putting Your Touch on Greatness, when the community come out to clean and to polish the work. Eternal Presence feeds from the Olmec heads that Wilson saw while he was in Mexico, the Buddhist heads at the MFA. It's neither male nor female, based on features of black models, but intended to be a universal image that could stand for all of humankind. It's enigmatic, and it ponders, in some ways, the entirety of experience from beginning to end. I quote, "It was my answer to all the omissions, the things I did not see in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts," Wilson said. "I wanted to make a black image that you could not ignore." The last sculpture that we will look at today is his commission from Congress of Martin Luther King. In 1984, a nationwide congressional competition was launched, and Coretta Scott King described how the sculpture for Congress should show Martin Luther King as, quote, the pastor and clergyman, serious-minded, concerned, compassionate, and with humility. And Wilson described how he wanted to, quote, convey the sense of his ideas and the spiritual energy that made him a universal symbol for peace and freedom. It was the first congressional commission to honor an African American and the first commission awarded to a black artist. And today the work sits under the cupola of the rotunda of the US Capitol. "I wanted people to recognize him," Wilson said, "but also I wanted to suggest the intangible energy and strength, this sense of dogged strength he had that allowed him to carry out these impossible campaigns. He was able to use his verbal skills to convince masses of ordinary people to do these extraordinary things. All of that is what I'm trying to put into a head." And cited today among founding fathers and past presidents, seen by millions of visitors annually, this contemplative portrayal redefines the meaning of monumentality. The MFA is fortunate to have this incredibly powerful preparatory drawing on the left that Wilson made for the sculpture, and in the exhibition it is juxtaposed against the model or maquette for the sculpture too. Wilson spoke of how so many of his portraits tend to fill a picture plane because, quote, "I want them to be images that can't be dismissed. I want them to confront people. I want to create something that can't be camouflaged into some background." Despite the small-scale nature of the drawing, Wilson conveys a sense of monumentality, his brooding eyes a window into the soul. And in the exhibition itself, we also include a number of the prints that are made after the drawing. To wrap up and conclude, we circle back to where we started with a self-portrait from 1944. If Wilson's earliest works declared his ambition to fight injustices, to make visible Black faces, figures, and experiences, his very last works are no less strident in underscoring the work still to be done to achieve representation, respect, and equality for all people. In this very late self-portrait, one of the last works that he made, which is in the exhibition, he literally cuts and scours into the paper to capture his visibly craggy and weathered face, a reflection of a lifetime of experiences. And that bold stare and penetrating gaze is as demanding as ever. In the exhibition, we have these two self-portraits separated by almost six decades, one on top of another, the elder Wilson looking down upon his younger self. For us, in this moment, it's a reminder that as a student, Wilson did not see himself at an institution like ours. And while many museums, such as the MFA, have sought to correct so many omissions in recent years, much of what Wilson called out and recounted remains as valid today as it was in 1944 when he made the self-portrait on the left, in 2002 when he made the one on the right, or today in 2025. It's true testament to why we cannot look away from Wilson's art, not just because of its strength of humanity, of empathy, and the message of social justice and Black dignity, but how his figurative work continues so powerfully and crucially to resonate amid today's national dialogues about race, equality, and representation. Thank you.
We have time for a couple questions. If you would like to raise your hand, we will come to you.
It's a quiet crowd today.
You left them stunned, Edward.
Thank you very much for teaching us so much about John Wilson. Could you tell us a little bit more about his technique and how he got those beautiful velvety blacks and those incredible lines in his work?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question because I think it's fair to say that from his very earliest works, it's evident he was a brilliant artist from a technical perspective. And himself actually describes his early works as being photographic in quality. So you have those very early images which have such incredible precision and ability. Many of those early drawings are made, for example, with a sharp graphite pencil or with a black crayon. But you find in images, and if I go back to, this is a perfect instance of that sort of quality of the photographic image. But then the sort of image that you're perhaps talking about is something like this, or this particular portrait, which I would happily rip off the wall of the exhibition. And this is one of those images where you actually don't realize, first of all, there is actually nothing here. He's in fact defining the shoulders with complete absence. And he's making these drawings, many we've thought originally many of these drawings were actually made with a sort of pastel. It's turned out to be with a sort of colored crayon, which is still soft enough to create the ability to really smooth with his own hands and his fingers, as well as with the edge of the actual crayon. And something else that you really see is that sense of a human touch. And so if you look at the prints in the exhibition of Martin Luther King, you'll actually see there are fingerprints all over the plates as well, that human touch is still very, very much there. This particular drawing is just the most beautiful pastel, and for any of us who've used pastel, you know how you can actually smooth it into these beautiful areas of tone. He was just an absolute master, and many of us at the museum actually think that this particular drawing of Roz is not just one of his greatest drawings, it's one of the greatest drawings we have in the collection. It has such an incredible presence and just an interplay of the darks and the lights in such a remarkable way. Question there?
I thought your presentation was just absolutely wonderful. And I'd like to know, did you know him personally? Because your interaction and your study of his work not only says that you're a scholar, but that you really knew him intimately, because you really, really personified his personality, his beliefs, and his art. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It is one of my regrets. I only met him once very, very briefly at an opening many years ago at Martha Richardson's. Never talked with him. Was in and out of the gallery super quickly. But the remarkable thing is that has, I think, come about from this project is the ability to talk with those who did know him. Whether it's members of his family, whether it is Martha Richardson, who has dedicated so much time to the archival material and to representing John's work. And John talked a lot and he wrote a lot. And we're fortunate enough to have a remarkable amount of his words, either on tape or in the written word. And it does allow you to get an incredibly strong sense of who he was. Somebody who was clearly indignant and angry at the current situation, but one who was also just remarkably dedicated to teaching, believed wholeheartedly in the power of art. And when you talk with his students, for example, there is an absolute love and devotion to who he was and what he meant to them. So I feel I know him vicariously at this point, but we're just incredibly fortunate that so much has survived that allows us to see his work through his own words and his own eyes.
And on that note, thank you so much for coming to this series, and thank you so much for Edward's wonderful presentation.